Hello, everyone, and Merry Christmas. Welcome to the FLATLINING Podcast from Fulcrum Strategies. I'm Matthew Handley. I hope everyone had a good holiday, and to all of our physician friends who had to work, we say thank you. Today, we're continuing our Best of 2023 series as we round out the year, but first, this. Thanks to you, our podcast and newsletter has grown over the past year, and we hope to continue to grow it further in 2024. For that, we still need your help. If you like what you're listening to on the FLATLINING Podcast, be sure to share it with your friends. Let them know to hit the subscribe button so they never miss an episode. And if they're listening on Apple Podcasts, ask them to leave us a review and 5 stars. If they're watching on YouTube, let them know to hit the subscribe button and ring the bell. Today, we're sharing our second most listened to episode of the year. As we know, weight loss drugs got a lot of hype this year as more were approved by the FDA with very promising results. But as has been noted by several lawmakers and activists, insurance companies are still refusing to cover these drugs. Ron and I discussed the new drug from Novo Nordisk called Wegovy and how it could change America's public health. You've probably seen the new TV commercials for the weight loss drug Wegovy, and we're going to be talking about that and other weight loss medications today on the program. What's sparking their popularity, how do they work, and will insurance cover them? And so, Ron, I guess that's going to be the first question that we have is how do we get to a drug like Wegovy? Because really, it's a spin-off, if you will, of a different drug for diabetic patients.
Yeah, so, every now and then, drug companies start down one path and they find out the drug says something either different or in addition. So, for example, Viagra was originally meant to be a cardiac drug. Mm-hmm. Okay. And they found that it didn't do what they thought it was going to do for cardiac stuff, but it had a different impact. So they said, hey, let's use it for that. What happened with Wegovy is Wegovy came out of a drug that was developed called Ozempic. It's been on the market for a long time. It's a wonderful drug. And Ozempic was designed around this idea of how to help people with diabetes. And what Ozempic does, and I'm going to do this in sort of layman's terms. I'm not a clinician, so if any doctors are listening, please, cut me some slack here. But what Ozempic does is basically slows down the body's digestion. Okay? That helps the diabetics so they don't have these wild swings in their sugar, if you will. And Ozempic works wonderfully. Helps immensely. Well, what they discovered both in the clinical trials and with the people that were on Ozempic is they lost weight, and which is also a good thing. It helps your diabetes. And they lost weight because they said they had this sense of always feeling full. Well, if you slow down digestion, you feel full longer. And so they didn't want to eat as much. So some genius in the marketing department, I'm sure, of Novo Nordisk said, hey, I wonder what would happen if we gave people a higher dose of Ozempic. Would they lose more weight? Okay. So there was a clinical trial, and it was not an expensive clinical trial because it's not like you're developing the new drug. You're just taking an existing drug that's been approved, and you're upping the dosage to see what happens. And lo and behold, there was a strong correlation. The more you give, the more you lose.
Right.
And the loss is significant. In the clinical trials, I want to say that the average person lost something like 20% of their body weight. That's huge. Okay. So thus was born Wegovy, which is really just Ozempic at higher dosages. And suddenly you had this once a week injectable medication that would make you lose weight, that we know is safe, has been on the market for a long time, that doesn't have any other nasty side effects, and it works. And it works pretty magically. That's how we got Wegovy.
So it's interesting because we've talked about research and development for drugs before, but this one, it as you mentioned, it definitely seems to be a very low risk thing for the manufacturer of Ozempic, which the manufacturer's name is escaping me right now.
Novo Nordisk.
Novo Nordisk. Thank you. Yep. Novo Nordisk. It was pretty low risk for them to try and come up with this drug. It's interesting too that it's coming out now, and it has FDA approval now, because Ozempic for a while there was a little bit of a shortage because so many doctors were prescribing it off label for weight loss. Are we seeing a significant increase in prescriptions of Wegovy over Ozempic now for that purpose, or are those numbers not really available anywhere?
So Wegovy was approved in June of 21.
Mm-hmm.
So it's been approved for a while. it has definitely been under demand, and there are still some shortages of Wegovy. And other countries, I think Canada just approved it. Other countries are trying to get it. So, Novo Nordisk is their hands full trying to make it up because it is a wonderful, very effective drug.
When we talk about some of these diabetic medications and some of these medical weight loss medications, one of the things that obviously factors into it is the cost. And it's my understanding right now that Wegovy is not covered by any of the insurance companies.
So most insurance companies, and there are some that do cover, like I think in North Carolina, State Employees Health Plan covers, and I think the feds may cover, but most general insurance companies have written Wegovy off of their formulary, so there is no coverage for it. It's not a determinant of you have to have a certain body mass, a BMI to get covered. It's not a medical necessity thing. They just aren't covering it. They aren't going to pay for it at all.
What's the reasoning behind that?
Well, there's sort of two reasoning. So opposed to, for example, gastric bypass surgery, the surgical intervention for morbid obesity. Most insurance companies cover gastric bypass surgery if your BMI is over a certain number, over 40, for example. But even if your BMI is over 40, they won't cover Wegovy because it's completely off formulary. And it's for two reasons. One, it's because they don't want adverse selection. We've talked about adverse selection before in this program, where I don't want to be the insurance company that attracts everyone with obesity. So if I'm the only one covering it, I'm going to get everybody. And obesity comes with a lot of other problems: diabetes, cardiovascular, blood pressure, cancer, et cetera.
And obesity comes with a lot of people in this country too. Right.
Yeah, about 100 million adults. Okay. So I don't want that kind of adverse selection. The other problem is, and this is going to get into the insanity that we're about to talk about in this program, it's more expensive than the surgery. Wegovy, and it's because of its cost, and we can throw a lot of stones at the manufacturer, but because of its cost and the fact that it is not a short-term medication, you're going to be on it for the rest of your life.
Right.
Is much more expensive than gastric bypass surgery. Gastric bypass surgery is on average about $20,000 to $25,000. Okay. Wegovy for 1 year is somewhere between $12,000 to $18,000 a year. Well, if you're going to get the gastric bypass surgery once, that's a lot less expensive than several years of Wegovy. And so it is cheaper to make people go through a very invasive surgery than it is to give themselves an injection in the thigh once a week.
So let's talk about the cost for a second, because as we know, there's a trend right now, either from federal price caps or from some companies taking it upon themselves to cap the price of things like insulin. Eli Lilly is an example. They did that a few weeks ago. What are we seeing from Novo Nordisk on the price of the drug? What does it cost out of pocket since it's not covered by insurance?
So out of pocket, retail, most places, it's about $1,400 a month.
Okay.
Now, they have these savings card programs where you can apply for the savings card and they'll peel back the price about $500. So, pretty much anybody who's going to pay for it out of pocket is going to pay somewhere between $900 and $1,000 a month.
And how much more is that than the current drug Ozempic?
Ozempic is still pretty expensive, but it's covered because it's diabetes. So it's not like it's more expensive than Ozempic, but it's not like Ozempic is $10.
Right.
It's just and I was just looking to see what Ozempic was.
It might depend on what your copay is and
if you're going to pay for it
out of pocket,
if your copay it's dirt cheap.
Yeah.
But if you had to pay sort of retail to it, the retail price is still pretty high. Yeah, so Ozempic retail price is about $900 to $1,000 a month as well. The problem is nobody has to pay retail because if you've got diabetes, you get Ozempic. It's covered by everybody.
What's the question then I have is for the people that have been getting Ozempic off label, are they having to pay out of pocket of that, or is their insurance covering that?
Well,
I guess it depends on the situation, but
yeah, a lot of insurances now, because they see the Ozempic game. And remember, the problem with Ozempic for weight loss is it isn't prescribed in the kind of dose you would need to get the same impact you get with Wegovy.
Right.
But a lot of insurance companies are starting to check the labs to make sure you really have diabetes and that the doctor didn't just put down the diagnosis. So they're going to say, well, what is your hemoglobin A1C? I want to see a number above X before I'm going to approve this, to try to cut off the off-label usage of Ozempic.
Mm-hmm. So as you mentioned, the bypass surgery is cheaper than having someone be on Wegovy for several years. But what are the risks involved with some of those surgeries? Are they riskier? Are they prone to more complications than what you would get by taking Wegovy?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, any surgery is prone to more complications than what you're going to get by taking Wegovy, because Wegovy really, it has some side effects. Some people will get a little nauseous. Some people will have diarrhea. Some people will, but the thing with Wegovy is if you start to have one of those side effects, you can back down the dosage. You can't, if you have a post-op infection from gastric bypass surgery, you can't just go, well, I'll back down the dosage. You sort of don't undo the surgery. And any surgery has inherent risk to it. And then you've got the recovery and all that. So if you're the patient, and even the doctors will say this, like the gastric bypass surgeons will say that Wegovy, is a much easier option, much more patient-friendly option. It's just more expensive.
Mm-hmm. Do you think that's going to change the coverage of Wegovy by the insurance companies, or do you think that even some maybe some the Novo Nordisk can convince some of the big employers to cover it through their self-paying, because it'll overall make their employees healthier?
Well, the employers have the same adverse selection problem that the insurance do.
Mm-hmm.
You don't want to be labeled as the employer who pays for Wegovy, because then you'll get a higher degree of obese people that are applying for your jobs.
Right.
So you don't want that. The other is, and let's look at it from a macro perspective. Okay. Most people think that obesity, with all of its various, conditions that get tied to it, et cetera, that they cost this country back in 2008, there was an estimate of about $147 billion. A lot of people think it's more like 200 billion now, 250 billion, somewhere in that range. Okay, well, that's a lot of money. All right, well, let's say, what if we treated everyone in the country that was obese by definition with Wegovy? Well, there's about 100 million adults with obesity in this country. If we treated everyone with Wegovy at the current cost of Wegovy, that's $1.2 trillion.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, well, even if we only treated half of them, okay, that's 600 billion. So it's at a macro level, it would be extremely difficult at its current cost, even with all the problems that obesity creates, in justifying paying for it,
mm-hmm.
because we'd be solving a $200 billion problem with 1.2 trillion in drug.
Mm-hmm.
Now, the other thing then you got to look at is, well, does it really need to cost that much?
Right.
If you look at, and I know there were other things going on, but if you look at Novo Nordisk's profit margins, and it's not like they were not making profit before Wegovy. Before Wegovy got approved, they made about $16 billion a year.
Mm-hmm.
And their profit was going up by about 6% a year, which is a pretty good number. After Wegovy got approved, their profit now is going up by an average of 14% a year.
Mm-hmm.
So they went from $16 billion a year to now they're making over $22 billion a year. So the point is, there's definitely some profit taking happening here, and this is a free market economy. But that's the reason also why it probably won't be covered anytime soon, because we can't afford to cover it, not at that price.
You mentioned that it was just approved in Canada and other countries in Europe, and I'm assuming Australia as well are probably looking at approving it. Of course, they do drug price negotiations and effectively price fixing in those countries. Do you think they're going to be able to fix a price for Wegovy for their citizens?
I think they're going to, because there's now another, in the same sort of drug class, there's another new one that has either just gotten approved or will be approved soon. And so there will be competition. So I think countries like Canada will go to the two different manufacturers and say, we're going to approve one of them, who gives me the best price.
Right.
Now, countries like Canada, and this is not a bad thing, are more than likely also going to have requirements on it. You only get Wegovy or Monaro, I think is the name of the other one, if your BMI is over a certain number. Because, we've heard the stories of, people in California who are not clinically obese using Wegovy to get those last 10 pounds off.
Right.
It'll do that too, but is that something that,
right,
insurance should pay for?
Mm-hmm. With the Inflation Reduction Act, as we've talked about before, it gives Medicare the ability to negotiate some drug prices. I don't know what the percentage is of U.S. citizens over the age of 65 that are on Medicare that would qualify as obese. I would assuming for Medicaid, it might actually be quite high. Is Wegovy going to be covered by Medicare and Medicaid?
I don't think it's likely to, but I don't think it's as big a deal for them. This is more of a bigger deal for commercial population. One, because, you think about if you're going to be on it for the rest of your life, you get some 30-year-old.
Right.
Okay, now you're paying for this for the next, 50, 60 years versus somebody in the last couple of years of their life or whatever from a Medicare perspective. So, it's a big problem for the commercial population.
So it's not like the Medicare CMS is not going to negotiate down the price of Wegovy as part of the Inflation Reduction Act.
I don't think this is going to be one of the drugs they're going to pick. They'll pick something else.
Yeah.
Because it's not a big a deal for them.
So this is going a little bit more back into how Wegovy and some of these other medical weight loss drugs work. But there was an interesting article in the New York Times several weeks ago that demonstrated that talk about a study that showed that after someone gets off Wegovy, by the time they're 12 months off of the drug, they've generally gained most of the weight back. And of course, the conclusion of that article was, weight is not a choice. And, clearly, it was kind of a fat phobic thing, which I get a little bit frustrated by sometimes when I read those. So why is that end of the spectrum wrong, and why is it also wrong on the other end of the spectrum to say that it's all about diet and lifestyle when it comes particularly to Wegovy?
Yeah. So the current thinking, and I'm talking about sort of the clinical thinking on why you have to be on Wegovy, why you can't lose the weight and then go off the drug and keep your weight off, revolves around two things. One, there is what people think is clearly a genetic tie to obesity. There's a strong correlation, and it's not just if you grew up in a house filled with obesity, you probably learned to eat wrong. They've tied genetic ties to obesity with kids who were adopted and grew up in an entirely different household that didn't have an obesity problem. So one, they know it's somewhat genetic. The other current thinking is that it's almost a body survival scenario that as humans, part of what we do and what every living thing does is tries to adapt to survive, is you get to, a certain weight or whatever, your body tries to always get back there. For, if you lose weight, it really works hard because what it's trying to do is, it's like bears hibernating and having enough fat to live through the winter in case there's a shortage or something. And so they think it's sort of an evolutionary defense mechanism that pushes people to that. But what they have clearly seen, even people who, said they were really, really trying hard, et cetera, is you go off Wegovy, you gain a lot of the weight back. And I'll tell you, I've been on Wegovy and I know it from personal experience. I was on Wegovy for a year. I lost 50 pounds. I went off Wegovy. I've gained half of that back. And I know that it wasn't because I wasn't trying to be good. And I've just recently gone back on Wegovy to take the weight off again. And so I weighed myself for the last year and a half every day so I can see the graph because I'm a numbers guy. And that's exactly the experience of what they've had with everything else. Now, the other thing that I also know is I know what happened with my blood pressure when the weight came off. I know what happened with my cholesterol. I know what happened with all my other labs. I've, from a purely health perspective, much healthier. Setting aside what the good that it does for your joints or for your back or for all this other stuff, the correlation to cancer risk, et cetera. So that's one of the things that I think is really disturbing in all of this is there are really good people who really could benefit from this, who are never going to reach, the point where either they'll hit the BMI to get gastric bypass surgery, or won't go under the knife because of that, who are going to have a much higher chance of dying earlier than they should because we can't figure out a way to provide a drug cost effectively, and make everybody happy. And Novo Nordisk developed it; they deserve to make money. Do they deserve to make this much money? That's a really good question.
Right. Well, let me ask you this then about the way our economy works in the United States, and I'll put an example of cars because I know you are a big car guy. When the first Tesla came out, those were very, very expensive, and now you have much more affordable Teslas. You've got almost every manufacturer working on electric cars right now. They're entering into the mainstream for the first time. Could we see the same thing with medical weight loss drugs like Wegovy? Are we going to start seeing other, drug manufacturers coming up with similar, Coke and Pepsi kind of products, and that's going to eventually drive down the cost because of the competition? Or do you think that because of the way the drug market's set up, that it'll always be expensive no matter what?
Well, no, I do think it will. I do think it will eventually come down, and we've seen that happen with other drugs. I mean, Claritin is cheap now. Used to be expensive. I mean, not like Wegovy expensive, but expensive. Now what? And you take your Tesla example. I mean, Tesla's even cutting the price on their cars now because of competition. It will take the drugs coming off patent,
right,
and enough competitors to drive it. Right now, there's really only one other competitor. I mean, it's Saxenda, which doesn't work nearly as well, but Wegovy and Monaro something, I forget what is another drug. Those are really the two competitors that are in the same sort of categories. As long as there's two, they'll both keep the price high because it's in their best interest to do so. Now, once they come off patent and somebody can make generic Wegovy, then you'll see the price fall. And then the competition will kick in. So it'll happen eventually, just not right away. And that's going to take several years before it comes off patent.
Right. I think when we I got two other things I want to discuss with you. One is kind of this weird trend of people wanting to selectively find a physician that is going to basically affirm everything that they're doing. And one of those things is weight. There's a growing trend among young people that they don't want to go to a doctor that's going to talk to them about their weight. What is that going to do to the public health of the United States if that is the trend of where we're going?
This is one of the areas where, I have to try to struggle to find that common ground, that middle point. Okay, let me tell you where my two pieces are. There's a part of me that says that if you're going to be a physician and you're going to take the Hippocratic Oath and you're going to do all this stuff, that it means telling people what they don't want to hear.
Right.
You have an obligation. I think your lawyer has an obligation to provide you good legal advice, and even if you don't like it, your accountant has an obligation to tell you that that's something you should or shouldn't do. And a doctor has an obligation to say, as much as, when I would go to my doctor, I don't like it when he says, "Hey, Ron, you're really overweight." Okay, that's not a fun thing to hear, but he's an obligation to tell me that. Now, there's part of me that says he should do that, and he or she should do that, and they shouldn't be able to not do it. And then the other side of me that says, but as a human and individual, I should have the right to say, I know, and I'm just going to keep doing it. You know what I mean?
Right. Yeah.
And that's really where I think my middle point is. I think if doctors stop giving what is the best clinical information, they should be held responsible for that. I thought that with the doctors who wouldn't give the right clinical information about the COVID vaccine. I think it about smoking cessation. I think about weight loss, things that are not controversial or shouldn't be from a clinical perspective. Now, if the doctor is noted in the chart, talked to Mr. Harrigan about his weight, he said he doesn't want to talk about it anymore, he understands, and he's making a conscious choice to live this way and to accept the risk, and he's noted that chart, then fine, he doesn't have to talk to me about it again. That's where I come down to it. But I don't like this trend of, doctors saying, well, if you want the doc who isn't going to ask, this is me, and I do it to get more patients.
Right. And I wonder, too, from the physician perspective, what kind of fear, if you will, of being, lit up on, Twitter or TikTok or wherever, and then all of a sudden you're the target of some sort of weird, don't go to this doctor kind of campaign because he said I was fat. And I think I'm more along the lines of in your boat that, if I go to my doctor and I want him to, if they're going to tell me something that I need to hear, I need to hear it. If I'm going to go to a mechanic, I don't want them to tell me there's nothing wrong with my car when there is.
Right.
So.
Right. Exactly. Yeah. And that's a huge thing right now with the kind of social media stuff that's out there for doctors in a lot of areas.
Mm-hmm.
You've got to be careful because, you don't want to be known as the doctor who won't prescribe a certain medication because, you try to people to do without, even though that, we can overprescribe at things. It's a tough thing.
Mm-hmm. The final thing I want to ask has to do with taking a drug regularly as part of a normal, healthy lifestyle. Is that the way that Western society in particular is going, do you think, or do you think that this is a temporary thing as we work on the public health of America?
Well, I think it depends on what the drug is, and it depends on what the patient's presentation is. I'll give you a perfect example. Cholesterol. Okay. Mm-hmm. We know what it does. There are people who, through no fault of their own, have a genetic condition called FH. Well, they will produce massive amounts of cholesterol, regardless of their exercise or diet. And I've met a young male who's never had a piece of fried food in his life, who mountain bikes on a regular basis, who looks like the epitome of perfect physical health, and who will throw a cholesterol number over 300. Okay, his body's just doing something wrong. Now, there's drugs that he can take for the rest of his life that will get that under control. Okay, to me, that's, yes, part of a normal, healthy lifestyle. To the extent that something like, for some people, obesity is a genetic marker thing, et cetera, taking Wegovy may be part of of a long, healthy lifestyle.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, I think we should always try to find where we can either scale back the drug or do away with the drug, but there are probably going to be some people who always do that. Now, the counter to that is, I know people who, take very large dosages of statins along with a gut agent, along with these other things to deal with their cholesterol. And I, watch them have 2 Big Macs and 4 large fries and at McDonald's every day. And you think, boy, that isn't what we were meant to do here. You're making it worse. And so to me, there's sort of that balance.
Right. And if you think about it too, we already kind of do that with some things. If you have a headache, you take 2 acetaminophen or Advil or whatever the case may be. If you need some digestive things, you take, Pepto-Bismol or Dramamine or something like that. Of course, the question though too is just with the over-the-counter stuff. Obviously, it's safe if you take it within the recommended dose because otherwise it wouldn't be sold over the counter. In the prescriptions, you need to have it be supervised by a physician. Do you have any final thoughts on the way that medical weight loss drugs like Wegovy are going, what the trend might be for prices in the near future, how this is going to affect the public health in the immediate future of the U.S.?
I will tell you that, my personal advice, setting aside my personal incentives around this, I really think that the manufacturers of Novo Nordisk and the manufacturers of drugs like this are really being short-sighted. And I think the risk that they're taking is these are the kind of things that will absolutely fuel the argument of why the government should take over healthcare. Because it's easy to look at something like this and say they're trying to fleece 100 million adults to make exorbitant profits. I mean, I got to believe Bernie Sanders is having a field day with this. And that if the government just controlled everything, we would tell them how much we're going to pay and everyone could have Wegovy and it would be free, And so, it's a little bit like, and I'll use the analogy, I thought it was brilliant when, the whole drunk driving thing started to get a big issue and Mothers Against Drunk Driving. And what happened? The major beer companies came out with these ads about designated drivers and be safe. And because they realized that they would rather sell a little bit less of their product and be in front of that than be hammered by something like raising the drinking age even more or making it harder or putting a tax on it. I just think that the over profit taking there is going to hurt them in the long run. And they would have a much better public opinion if they could get in front of it now, like the insulin folks have, and said, hey, this is a problem, and we're going to step up, and we're going to cap Wegovy at X dollars a month. And then they could put pressure back on the payers to cover it. So I think eventually this price will come down. It's too high. There's too many people demanding it. It's going to catch too much flack for why on earth does it cost that much to, for a once a week injection of a drug you already had on the shelf. It can't cost that much to make that pen. And so I think it'll eventually come down. I just don't know exactly when.
Come back next week to hear our most popular episode of 2023 on the Flatlining Podcast.